If you have to choose between health and privacy, we should choose freedom. Harari recently wrote a piece concerning what the world will be like after the coronavirus crisis, and he stressed that there doesn't have to be a conflict between health and privacy. But he's wrong. We need to collect data to improve our health in the best possible manner. The problem is that so far we haven't yet realized the democratic usage of our data. The various solutions the big countries have come up with so far do not correspond to such a model. We've got the Chinese way of dealing with the data. Here, the data is being collected by the government, but there the legal foundations as such have focused on norms. They are based upon values which cannot be reconciled with the achievements of the Enlightenment. Furthermore, we've got the US-American way of dealing with the data. And here the data is primarily collected by the big companies, and they thereby get so powerful by having all that information that they become quasi-political players. In this way, the very foundations of a liberal democratic system are being undermined. Then we've got the European way of dealing with the data, and here we've got rigid Data Protection Act. So we don't gather the data in the first place. Therefore, we cannot promote health in the appropriate manner. So this is why this needs to be altered. We need to establish a proper democratic usage of our data. And we should choose health when the choice is between health and privacy. Because what we actually care about is health and freedom. And health and freedom can both be chosen. There is no conflict between these two. But there is a necessary conflict between health and privacy. We don't really care about privacy. And I will show this by considering the various theories associated with privacy. Well, there is a sanction theory and there's a property theory of privacy. And these are not mutually exclusive theories. So firstly, there's the issue of the property theory of privacy. According to that theory, basically the digital data is an extension of ourselves. We mix ourselves with something external. Digital data is intellectual property. And if the government forces us to give up upon our intellectual property, then there's a worry that basically the government stealing our data. Expropriation takes place. But this doesn't have to be the case if the data is being used for something which is strongly in our interest. And what is strongly in our interest is a universal health insurance. It's an enormously wonderful achievement which we need to cherish, which we need to develop further. And it's an extremely expensive structure. So we need to find a reliable way of financing it. And one way of doing so is if the data which gets collected by the government is being used to at least partially pay for the universal health insurance. And if this is being done, it's not an expropriation. The second issue is that of the sanctions. And here the following comes in. We are worried that we get sanctions as a consequence of other people having access to our digital data. However, we need to realize that in certain circumstances, sanctions are necessary. It's good that there are sanctions. For example, if there is a murder of an innocent child, then it is just that the person gets sanctions. So what we're actually worried about is illegitimate sanctions. So where we are not doing something which should get sanctions. Maybe we should only get sanctions where a person directly harms another person. Otherwise, this shouldn't apply. So how can this be realized? One of the most important things to consider is that we need to restrict the access to the data. So wherever the data gets stored, humans should have as little access to it as possible. It should be primarily algorithms which process the data, which check whether something's wrong and when interventions are needed. Only in the case of utter emergencies it should be humans who have the right to check these digital data. In these circumstances, the risk of abuse is minimized. That's an as good as it gets solution. And all I'm suggesting here are not perfect solutions. They're only like as good as they get. That's an as good as it gets ethics. The second suggestion we need to focus on is that we need to promote the plurality of human flourishing much further than what is given at the moment. So only when really one person directly harms another person, then sanctions should be considered. And this is not the case even in the most enlightened countries around. I mean, one example would be incest among consenting adults. It's here a group, 2 or more consenting adults getting together deciding to have sex. Why should it be the government's business to say something against it, to turn it into an illegal activity? But this is what is the case in Germany. Incest among consenting adults is illegal. It is not illegal in Spain. So here, that's one example which shows what it means that a great plurality of concepts of the good needs to be promoted, those that each one of us can live according to his or her desires, wishes and fantasies, as long as no other person gets harmed. The third issue which needs to be considered is that of implementing e-governance. And that could be a way of promoting transparency, which is also a way of reducing illegitimate forms of sanctions. So, if all of these suggestions were taken into consideration, then a democratic usage of our data could be realized. So the first suggestion I have in mind was the data which gets collected must be used in our interest to avoid expropriation. And the goal which we want, which is in our interest, is that of the data covering at least partially our universal health insurance. And that would be an enormously helpful way of using these data. Because the goal is something which the great majority of people want, namely universal health insurance. The second central goal I was suggesting is that we need to make sure that access to the data gets restricted. It should be primarily algorithms which have access to it. Humans should, as long as possible, not have access to it to reduce the risk of the data being abused. And the third central suggestion was the one that we need to promote human flourishing, that the greatest possible plurality of human concepts of the good can be lived in accordance with. We need to have a much greater plurality than what is given even in all of the liberal enlightened countries today. So if all of this was realized, then we would have a proper democratic usage of our data. So if we are forced to choose between health and privacy, we should choose freedom, so that the greatest plurality of human flourishing can be guaranteed.